Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'll do my best to speak loudly so that you guys up the back can hear. That was easy. I'm really delighted to be here tonight among so many supporters of civil liberties and human rights. Naturally, we invited our friends from ASIO to buy a table or two, but they politely declined, assuring us that they are already under every table and probably inside the phones of quite a few of you as well. They even suggested that Cameron Murphy, Stephen Blanks and Verity Firth should upgrade to an iPhone 6 so that they get faster downloads from your phones. You should update them tonight at the trending hashtag, #HeyASIO, where all the best jokes on Twitter are being made today about the new security laws. Now, we meet under the shadow of a federal government that is waging a relentless war on some of our most precious human rights. Never before has an Australian government talked so much about freedom while doing so much to undermine it. Just this week, our man at the Savage Club, the chest-thumping Attorney General, George Brandis, is living up to his club's name through his new terror bills. Our Christian friend, Immigration Minister Scott Morrison, is also busy dispensing Old Testament tough love through his new refugee laws, packing off refugees to Hun Sen's one-party state in Cambodia. The government stocks are rising as it takes advantage of public anxiety about terrorism to ram through new laws. To be sure, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria needs to be combated to protect civilians from human rights violations there. But the threat in Australia is modest, and the government is shamelessly overcooking it. The government speaks in inflammatory terms of a death cult that hates our freedoms and way of life. But if you look at recent events here as ordinary crimes and avoid labelling them as terrorism or being mesmerised by the 900 police officers involved in raids last week, you get a very different perspective. One man attempted to murder 2 police officers. Another has been arrested for an early conspiracy to murder someone not yet identified. There was some chatter about Parliament House, but so far that's it. Perhaps 60 Australians are also fighting in the Middle East, a tiny minority from amongst 23 million Australians. Listening to our politicians and media, you'd think that we're under siege, like in French Algeria or Indochina in the wars of the 1950s and 60s, or Iraq at the height of the insurgency, plagued by daily suicide bombings. We need to take a deep breath, get a grip and get some perspective. Terrorism is not an existential threat. Nazism, Imperial Japan, the nuclear holocaust during the Cold War were existential threats. Terrorism in Australia is a minor irritation, more mosquito than lion. Your own furniture is more likely to kill you. Khalif al-Baghdadi is nothing compared to your bookcase, and certainly compared to George Brandis's $15,000 Library of Alexandria. Falling televisions are especially dangerous, but we don't make it a crime to visit Bing Lee without the Foreign Minister's permission. As one writer put it this week, you've got a greater chance of dying from falling out of bed, tumbling off a ladder, getting the runs, dying at the hands of your lover at home, in police custody, or driving home than by being killed by terrorists. The government says it's not targeting the Muslim community and that this is about crime, not Islam. But there's certainly a lot of dog whistling. The Prime Minister's divisive rhetoric about everyone having to be on Team Australia is a case in point. He tells us that, quote, everyone has to put this country, its interests, its values and its people first, and you don't migrate to this country unless you want to join our team. This from a man born in England to an English father, telling us how to be Australian. When our Prime Minister subordinates the magical diversity of what it means today to be Australian to some absurdly jingoistic, reductive view of national identity, it's no surprise that others take it further. From hateful graffiti smeared on walls, to calls to halt Muslim immigration or strip them of citizenship, to Islamophobic attacks on Australian women wearing the headscarf. Jackie Lambie should focus her energy on banning clothing that's truly offensive to all Australians, like Tony Abbott's lycra pants or budgie smugglers. Talk of Team Australia is precisely un-Australian, careless, stupid, repressive talk that has no place here. My family has been in this country for over 2 centuries, coming as convicts and falling at Gallipoli. As part of the oldest of white Australia, I can say that Tony Abbott does not speak for us. Human rights and mutual respect are our values. Politicians should champion them. Governments are always tempted to reach for new laws when security is threatened. Intelligence agencies never say they have enough power or stop asking for more. Excessive laws are virtually never wound back. The truth is that Australia already has enough laws to deal with terrorism. Since 9/11, our Parliament has been amongst the most hyperactive lawmaker on the planet. Much of it is never used, much of it goes too far, from preventive police detention to ASIO detention powers virtually incommunicado. National security cannot be allowed to stand on the shoulders of everything else. Otherwise, our hard-won liberties dissolve into the muck of doing whatever it takes. More powers are not the answer. Good policing, work with communities, efforts to address the root causes of alienation are all more effective. Overreaction is also, of course, endemic in our response to refugees. The thrust of yesterday's bill is to take refugee decisions as far outside the rule of law as is possible, narrowing the refugee definition, cementing fast-track processing, excluding natural justice, limiting review, extending and immunising powers to detain and expel at sea, and preempting even High Court challenges. The bill erases all references to the Refugee Convention. The Immigration Minister spat the dummy in Parliament on international law, saying, quote, "This Parliament should decide what our obligations are under those conventions, not those who seek to direct us otherwise from places outside this country, whether foreign courts or United Nations bodies." The Minister then assured us that Australia will comply with its international obligations, which is presumably not difficult if international law is now simply whatever the government says it is. It goes without saying that no government has a right to arrogantly, in bad faith, auto-interpret the scope of its own treaty obligations. It also goes without saying that Australian politicians hardly have a monopoly on wisdom, good policy and morality when it comes to refugees. We all know the rest of the miserable story of Australian refugee policy: protracted and even indefinite illegal detention, cruel and inhuman conditions where refugees suicide, are beaten to death or die from treatable infections, factories which manufacture mental illness, naval interceptions and offshore processing based on these grand lies about queue jumping, people smuggling and the need to save lives at sea. Shifting our burden onto and bribing poor neighbours like Papua New Guinea, coddling dictators in Cambodia and war criminals and torturers in Sri Lanka, undermining constitutionalism in Nauru. Ours is a system which punishes refugees and is designed to stop them coming whatever the human cost. But if I were to sum up the whole diabolical Byzantine field of Australian refugee policy, I'd say this: Australia is just monumentally stingy. I've just returned from the Syrian border in Jordan and Turkey, where small, poor countries like Lebanon and Jordan are bursting at the seams with epic influxes of millions of refugees from the Syrian and Iraq crises. Half of Jordan's population are now refugees. In the past week alone, Turkey has received 140,000 refugees, more than Australia has received in decades, all put together. That's on top of 1 million refugees already there in Turkey. That is a real emergency. and those countries still do not close their borders. Australia receives a few thousand boat people, and our politicians on both sides, our media, and many Australians go into meltdown. We have no sense of proportion, like a child that can't control itself. Stinginess, selfishness, paranoia, and racism have become defining characteristics of our nation and our character. We've catastrophised and militarised a pedestrian challenge. But of course, Australia has to take the world as we find it, not how we wish it to be. If refugees come and have no safe place, we should not refuse them sanctuary based on unnecessary, excessive, wasteful, illegal, and cruel policies. Of course, the major parties are in lockstep on many of these abuses, whether refugees or terrorism. Recall that the Labor government squandered its once-in-a-generation opportunity to adopt a Bill of Rights, despite overwhelming public support for rights protection in the national consultation. Instead, we got lame statements of compatibility attached to new bills, which whitewash and legitimise rights violations almost every time. We also got a new Human Rights Parliamentary Committee, which wrings its hands at violations, but is powerless to stop them. Many Australian politicians have either a pathological hostility to human rights or just an indifference to them. This malaise stretches back to the foundation of modern Australia. A Bill of Rights, remember, was rejected during the drafting of the Constitution because it was said that elected parliaments would never violate rights as long as you were white. This view persists and is supplemented by the idea that the courts diminish the sovereignty of Parliament, take their power away, by protecting rights when politicians want to take them away. There's also a view that human rights are somehow only used to shield criminals, terrorists, and illegal immigrants. Now, the fallacies of these arguments have been well exposed. It's naive to seriously believe that Parliament alone is sufficient to safeguard human rights. Majority tyranny is not democracy. Limitations on power and judicial enforcement of those limitations has always been critical to sustaining democracy. Personally, I think this kind of hostility or indifference to human rights is a legacy of our history. It's self-evident to peoples of countries founded in blood or violence that human rights should enjoy the strongest possible protection. Whether Europe rebuilding after Nazism, Latin America after military rule, Africa and Asia after long wars of liberation against colonialism. The strong protection of rights is a deliberate break with the past and a shedding of the arbitrariness and excesses of the old regime. In contrast, great violence and suffering has never touched the mainstream in Australia. No wars on home soil or revolution or dictatorship. Those who have suffered, our Indigenous people, for example, have never held power and haven't been able to make the rules. We have no deep social memory or lived experience of why human rights matter. Instead, our politics is driven by a majoritarian conception of the common good, a concern to protect mainstream interests, the battlers and the families of middle Australia. We just don't get it as those whose rights are systematically violated understand why they're important. Our desiccated constitution, of course, is simply not up to the task. Now, it's true that charging the courts with resolving disputes according to human rights standards makes them more political. We shouldn't shy away from that. If politicising the courts means empowering them to strike down indefinite detention, which drives refugees to suicide and despair, I say, bring it on. The price is worth it. The costs of inaction are unspeakably cruel. The truth is that all judicial decisions are political, including interpretive choices by High Court judges to uphold indefinite detention. Our member of the Savage Club, Senator Brandis, and his acolytes from the Institute of Public Affairs have taken the political attack on human rights now to a new level. The Attorney General's so-called traditional civil and political freedoms agenda is an ideological war on human rights that pretends to defend them. Amongst his highest priorities are defending an absolutist idea of free speech, including hate speech, and loosening corporate, environmental, and industrial regulations. His offsider from a right-wing think tank, our new Freedom Commissioner, with few qualifications or experience in human rights, is especially concerned that native vegetation laws impinge on farmers' rights to abuse their land, and that local councils prevent those with oceanfront properties from developing them in the face of rising seas. Nelson Mandela's freedom agenda pales next to this. The suffering of Andrew Bolt is especially incomparable. The freedom agenda is ridiculous for so many reasons. It's an attempt to co-opt the language of human rights to protect business interests and to deflect criticism of the government's own abuses. Corporations are not generally downtrodden, and by the way, are not humans entitled to human rights. The government's agenda attempts to silence or diminish the violations suffered by those who are most vulnerable, disadvantaged or powerless. The government's obsessed by boutique human rights concerns, like defending bigotry, which most Australians believe to be cruel and unreasonable. It denigrates the rights that most Australians think important, like freedom from discrimination or from being sacked for being pregnant. This agenda naively believes that the law somehow has no place in dealing with racism, that victims of abuse on a bus can somehow engage a racist thug in a reasoned conversation and persuade them that they're wrong. It fails to understand that the state is not just a threat to human rights, but a necessary guarantor of rights from intrusion or predation by private interests. The freedom agenda also cherry-picks some rights as indispensable to democracy when others are equally important. We can hardly participate fully in liberal democracy if we're starving, homeless, illiterate, jobless, deprived of healthcare or social support. Economic and social rights matter just as much. Our social democracy is one of the most stable and prosperous in the world, precisely because it takes care of those in need. And we've avoided the dysfunction and poverty that dogs free enterprise America. The freedom agenda is also philosophically incoherent. The attorney's idol, John Stuart Mill, would be turning in his grave at how he's being verbaled by the Attorney General. Mill was not a liberal extremist and accepted social limits on human rights. The musings of a 19th century Englishman are also hardly the last word on how to govern multicultural modern Australia. Mill, after all, defended despotic rule over barbarians and backward classes. He worked and plundered for the British East India Company. He was all for the freedom of employers to maintain unsafe workplaces. He thought progressive taxation was robbery, and he later became a socialist who wanted to replace capitalism with workers' cooperatives, some liberal hero. If the government was serious about traditional rights, it could focus on eliminating the many violations of civil and political rights which it itself has created or perpetuated. Firstly, why is the government destroying one of the oldest and most basic rights, stemming back 800 years to the Magna Carta, that is freedom from arbitrary or illegal imprisonment? The government administratively detains thousands of refugees for protracted or indefinite periods. We allow preventive detention of suspected terrorists in order to bypass criminal law safeguards. We lock away the mentally ill, sometimes in police stations. We don't deal with the extraordinary over-incarceration of Indigenous Australians. I'm thinking of the 22-year-old woman from Western Australia who died recently in custody after being detained for not paying some fines. Or the man scorched alive in the back of a paddy wagon in the outback heat not so long ago. Secondly, why does the government hobble free speech if it cares so much for it? By introducing a vague new crime of encouraging or promoting terrorism, whatever that means. By permitting excessively wide defamation laws to shield the powerful and the government's mates. by criminalising intelligence whistleblowers or journalists who expose illegality or impropriety by our security services? Why does it retain nanny state classification standards which unduly restrict what grown-ups may read or watch? Thirdly, why does the government impair the classic traditional freedom of association through the many ill-defined crimes of involvement with a terrorist group, or by allowing draconian anti-bikie laws to mushroom around the country? Why does the government permit restrictions on the right to strike and freedom of association, including collective bargaining, contrary to international labour standards? Fourthly, why does the government underline the classic freedom of religion by persisting with a school chaplaincy program that in practice makes Christianity the default religious presence in state schools, dangerously blurring the separation between church and state, and making taxpayers subsidise Christianity? Fifthly, why does the government interfere in the classical private sphere of personal autonomy by prohibiting same-sex marriage, preventing refugees on temporary visas from living and reuniting with their families, enabling mass surveillance of the innocent through deceptive warrants that access whole computer networks, letting police taser us willy-nilly for minor infractions, infantilising and demeaning refugees by making them sign codes of conduct which nobody else has to abide by, or by not introducing a new cause of action to protect privacy, as so many inquiries have recommended over the years. Sixthly, why does the government restrict the classic freedom of movement by criminalising visits to a place the Foreign Minister doesn't want you to go without proof of any involvement by that person in crime, violence or terrorism? Why does it restrict freedom of movement by coercing refugees to live in rural areas now? Why does it mandate house arrest under control orders for suspected terrorists? Seventh, why does the government restrict classic political freedoms like the right to vote for prisoners, and thus undermine the very foundations of liberal democracy, namely universal and equal suffrage? 8, what about the classical right to equal treatment in a country where female workers lag behind in every indicator, from pay to workforce participation to representation among CEOs on corporate boards and in Parliament? And where sexual harassment is endemic in our institutions like the military, and where a female Prime Minister is misogynistically pilloried by the Attorney's own party. Number 9, what about the destruction of basic rule of law principles by this government, such as the near total denial of due process to over 50 refugees, given adverse security assessments by ASIO, which serves as judge, jury and executioner? And many of these people have been in detention without end for 5 years now. Or what about the migration bill, which eliminates natural justice, or the terrorism bill, which confers blanket immunity on security operatives, or the chronic underfunding of legal aid, which prevents the most marginal from vindicating their traditional rights when others breach them? Why does the government politically abuse legal processes to pursue their ideological enemies, such as a royal commission targeting trade unions? Why does the government erode the already weak institutions we have for safeguarding rights, for instance by reducing funding to the Human Rights Commission and politicising it with ideological appointments of the attorney's mates? Such steps critically undermine accountability for the exercise of public power and undermines public confidence in government and the legal system. All of these things I've mentioned are human rights abuses in the real world, not the terrifying perils of regulation in the corporate boardroom. Restoring the balance is another way of saying the government wants to pick and choose whose rights it respects and whose it violates with impunity. This is not democratic rebalancing. It just gives more power to the powerful, leaves the powerless with even less. And these are just traditional civil and political rights, which the government says it cares so much for. The government is also actively undermining economic and social rights. Equality of opportunity in education is at serious risk from deregulation of universities. The quality of education in schools is under attack from the politicisation of the curriculum, with a renewed emphasis on Judeo-Christian and British heritage, and an obsessive focus on imperial British war campaigns like Gallipoli, as if Gallipoli is not already the most heavily memorialised event and the most visited place in Australian historical and public consciousness. Accessible and affordable healthcare is being compromised by new upfront fees. Vulnerable young people are having their welfare cut and are being punished for the government's own failure to generate enough jobs for them. Private property rights are now coming to trump collective Indigenous land ownership. Indigenous peoples are being deprived of control over their communities and their customary laws, and deprived of representative political institutions, and remain under the reign of a paternalistic, racially interventionist, centrist white state. It's little wonder that people deprived of control over their own economic future and political destiny suffer across the whole spectrum of disadvantage. The point is that if the government was serious about genuinely addressing human rights problems, it wouldn't shunt off its concerns to a low-powered Law Reform Commission inquiry or a wasteful parallel inquiry by the Freedom Commissioner. Instead, it would act now by repealing bad laws, or amending them, or refraining from adopting new bad laws. We already well know the gamut of rights violations in Australia. There are few surprises. There's just no political will to fix them. The government could also show its heartfelt concern by adopting a Bill of Rights. I mean, why dabble at the edges when a systemic fix is readily available? Why allow your colleagues or future Labor governments to violate the rights you care so much about if you could entrust the independent courts to safeguard them? Even in foreign policy, the government is undermining human rights. To use just one example, the Attorney General refuses to recognise East Jerusalem as occupied territory, gifting it to Israel. The Foreign Minister suggests Israeli settlements in Palestine are illegal. All of this flies in the face of almost 50 years of near universal international legal consensus through the General Assembly, the International Court of Justice, and even the Security Council. We're the 12th largest economy in the world. We're more than a middle power. We are one of the few countries capable of making a difference to human rights in other places. Who will defend the victims of human rights violations if we don't step up? To conclude, some of the great light of human rights is fading in Australia. It's a cause of sorrow and shame that our institutions seem incapable of arresting it. The work that many of you do for Civil Liberties is precious and helps to stave off the darkness, even if it's often a slow, frustrating calling, battling issue by issue to make headway, to make governments take notice. But without that commitment and courage, our country is in danger of becoming, in the words of our great bush poet, Randolph Stowe, a desert of broken quartz racked by the crow. The good news, and a cause for optimism, is that most Australians have seen straight through the Attorney General's absolutist agenda. His attempt to wind back racial discrimination laws met with powerful opposition not only from ethnic and Indigenous communities, but also from the Anglo mainstream. Nobody except Brandis Bolt and his think tank friends thought that the law went too far or had been abused. Almost everyone thought it had served its intended purpose of making people feel safer from racial abuse and humiliation. Few were convinced that an extremist right to be a bigot outweighed the interests of minorities to be secure from racist attacks destructive of their identity, dignity, and self-worth. It's also a cause for hope that state and federal consultations on bills of rights have shown that concern for human rights has wide and deep roots in the community, even if politicians are often hostile or indifferent or fail to show leadership. This is something to build on. We must continue to stiffen the spine of politicians. and to combat the malevolent shock jocks. We must prevent the government from co-opting human rights to serve corporate interests. We must broaden the base of civil liberties beyond our inner city sanctuaries and reach deeper into the suburbs. We have to become better at explaining to ordinary Australians why human rights matter and why they should compel their representatives to take them more seriously. We must convince more people that Australia should be a place of true liberty, not gulags, fairness, not faceless security officers, empathy, not cruelty, and courage, not fear. Thank you.